it's really bad. Obviously, very, very bad news for Nokia on the kind of mobile network side of things, because I think they were deriving I think their own estimates were saying about 5% to 8% of revenues coming from AT&T. I mean, they're huge companies. The US operators are really, really important to the big kit vendors in the Nordic countries, because for a start, they're very big.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. It's just me and Ian this week, and we're recording it a little bit early because later on we're going to go and do the Glotel Awards, which is the Telecoms.com annual awards thing, where I have to stand up on stage in a dinner jacket and try and be entertaining and then read out all the short lists and all that stuff.
But don't say you have to. You love
performing. That makes it sound like a real chore.
That's true. I probably framed that in a slightly more arsey way than I intended. What I'm saying is that's my job on the night.
Yeah. Have you got a professional up there with you doing the jokes?
Zoe Lyons, comedian. Yep.
I don't know her, I don't think.
She's been on like all the usual stuff like panel shows and Live at the Apollo and that sort of thing.
Right.
So yeah, I've never met her before. I'll be meeting her later on immediately after this. So I'm having to pace myself. I'm still having a couple of drinks, but I obviously can't be mashed.
No.
And make a fool of myself up on stage any more than I normally do anyway. So yeah, that's my only opening bollocks. So, Ian, you had a bit of a late night last night, is that right?
I did. There was an Axicom drinks do for Christmas. They're lovely offices, by the way.
Right.
Possibly the best PR company offices I've ever been to.
God, I've never been there. I keep blowing them out. I mean, I was invited, but obviously knowing what these PR drinks are like and knowing you'd be there, I was thinking I can't be mashed the night before the Globe Tales.
I didn't expect it to be as late and as drunken as it turned out to be, but inevitably
what time did you knock it on the head?
Well, I got home at about 2, I think.
Ouch.
We finished at their office. Their office, by the way, is on Southwark Bridge Road, and it's like pretty much on the river.
Southwark Bridge Road. I know that area. Yeah. So it's actually about half an hour from here.
It's really close to us,
isn't it?
So, I mean, Rob Shrimpton, who's the sort of main guy on their side that I know and deal with, several times said if we wanted to go over there after
just randomly
the pod on a Friday and meet up for a drink, then we could do that. They have a rooftop bar, which obviously the weather wasn't really rooftop bar weather yesterday. But and then the level below is like there's a subsidised bar, so you can get beers for like £4, and it's
it says something when subsidised a beer still costs £4
Yeah, it's better than 7 though, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And it was,
when we go to PRs, it's normally even more subsidised than that.
Yeah, I mean, Axicom seems to deal with lots of sectors. So I have to say, I didn't know the vast majority of people there. The people I knew were Harry and Georgia from Total Telecom.
Right.
Rob, Teresa, my colleague, was there, and one or two others, but pretty much talking to Harry and Georgia and.
Okay, cool.
What's the name? Anne-Marie, who's James's colleague at Tech Informed, was there as well.
Oh yeah.
Although I don't think she stayed especially late. So.
But James wasn't there.
James wasn't there. He's apparently in America at the moment doing work.
Oh right, being a high-flying exec.
Yeah, but we sort of finished and then went to London Bridge to one of those pubs, the Market Porter or something.
Right, that just stayed open.
The Wheat Sheaf, I think it's called.
Stupidly late.
Yeah. And it was, and then I thought they were all still there. I left. I had 1 pint and thought,
right, and they were still larging it. Well, fair play to you, Axicom. So
yeah, thanks very much. It was really nice. They put food on as well.
Cool.
They had a bingo, by the way.
Oh, right.
And it was like a word bingo thing.
It wasn't like bullshit bingo.
It was one of those things where you have like weird tech expressions in, like or words to do with like business jargon. Like
so it is bullshit bingo.
Maybe it is bullshit bingo. Yeah. But
no, that's a brilliant one. It originated as something that people took into boring meetings. Yeah, and they'd get through it by getting through. It
had expressions like cloud native in as well.
Right.
So there was some tech.
So there's a bit more
techy, and there was some business jargon in there as well.
Yeah.
And the woman who did it was really good. Teresa won.
Wow.
£500 worth of vouchers, and I think her excitement faded a bit when she realised it was vouchers with Hotpoint, which does like white goods.
Yeah. What a weird thing to give you vouchers for.
Is like
it's like if you want a new tumble dryer or a washing machine.
Why were they giving out washing machine vouchers?
I think she's in a situation where she's not really going to be spending money on a washing machine or a tumble dryer in the next sort of year or so probably. So. But we said you could probably put it on eBay and sell it for £50 less or something, and
surreal.
Yeah,
or just give her the cash, give her a briefcase.
Cash. I mean,
like the good old days, give her a brown envelope.
Yeah.
But I was just saying earlier, I was writing my script for the Glowtales, and I do an opening monologue. And, I'm not deluding myself that I'm a comedian, but I try and make it entertaining. And on one draft, I did have a bit of a monologue about my minimum bribe threshold. But I decided to cut that out because it's one of those things where I know I'm joking. So there we go. Actually,
you're going to mention Anais.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to do that. And actually, one other thing, after the pod last week, that turned into a long one because we did our usual thing on the pod, and then we went and met our mates from CC Group PR, one of who's their head of telecoms, called Anais, is leaving. And you never know, she might come back, but she's leaving to go and travel around the world. So fair play to her. Nice one, Anais. And it was great hanging out with you and Katie and Adam. And we had a few beers in the Rose and Crown, and we went and had a cheeky Nando's. And then I think, was it just you, me and Adam that went for some after as well at the Ring?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd even forgotten about that.
I know. We're just not very good at just calling it a night, are we?
No. No, I proved that last night.
You proved that last night. Well, you're doing all right. You look on...
Yeah, I don't feel brilliant.
You feel a bit rough around the edges. Well, I'm sure that beer's sorting everything out.
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, so that's all. I just want to say bon voyage to Anais.
Yeah.
Look forward to hearing about her odyssey.
Definitely.
Around, I think it's going to be like...
Southeast Asia,
Southeast Asia and all that jazz, and Asia Pacific. Yeah, right, let's get on with it. What are we going to chat about? What's up?
It's somebody's birthday tomorrow.
Somebody's birthday tomorrow. Yours? Is it your birthday tomorrow?
It is my birthday tomorrow, yeah.
Oh, that's the other reasons you're off, apart from the fact that you know that you'll have had a couple.
You get this day off on your birthday thing, don't you? Which I've never ever made use of.
No, well, I haven't been. I've been trying to make use of it this year, and I think on my birthday I was travelling back from Paris after Network X.
Yeah, that doesn't really count, does it? Though?
Yeah,
but you can take it another time.
Yeah. And what if it's a weekend? Yeah, I might have taken it, but anyway, okay. Well, happy birthday for tomorrow. How old are you going to be?
51.
51.
If you remember last year on my birthday, we were sitting on a podcast with Dennis O'Brien.
That's it. That's how come I got that minimum bribe threshold line that I scrubbed, because I'm going to mention in my, I normally mention the top read most stories of the year. Well, this year I'm going to do the top 3 pods as well. And I mentioned the Dennis O'Brien one, and I was going to mention, which I haven't in the end, that he brought us these really pricey bottles of wine and called that bribe of the year.
He re-gifted them, remember?
Oh, he
was honest about it.
He re-gifted
He
them.
re-gifted.
Yeah. He was like, I got to be honest, these are like...
I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dennis, you can keep re-gifting us that shit.
Maybe we should be re-gifting them. I still haven't drunk mine yet.
No, I drank mine.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, it's got to get drunk now, hasn't it? Otherwise, it's probably not very good anyway now.
Oh no, I think that Reds can keep for a long time.
Okay, good.
I mean, you could pay just thousands of pounds for ones that are decades old.
Yeah.
But yes, and so that was what made me go down that bribe avenue. But I thought, do you know what? I think I won't.
Yeah.
Cool. Especially as it's awards on which I'm a judge. It's probably even better not to mention bribes and that sort of thing. Right, what are we going to chat about? So I've been kind of obsessed with writing my script and all that sort of thing. So I haven't given it that much thought, and I haven't written a ton. But there has been some quite juicy stuff this week. There was one that we covered, but I didn't write it myself, and I don't think you wrote it for light reading, but you were on top of it, which was this story about an analyst called Earl Lum wrote a LinkedIn post reckoning that maybe T-Mobile US is going to drop Nokia as a vendor, and went into quite detailed rationale as to why.
Yeah.
So I think we'll cover that. I mean, all we're really doing is passing on that message. I certainly don't have any novel insight into it, but I think it's worth discussing just what it says about the sort of broader environment for these sort of kit vendors and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then some other stuff that Light Reading's covered, which I find quite interesting. Mike's been on good form this week. He'd written another one talking about the plummeting value of 5G millimetre wave spectrum. And at the same time, you wrote a story, which I think you published this morning, that's headlined Mavenir risk default or restructuring after failure to crack 5G, which I presume, I haven't read it, which I presume says that, that they're financially looking a little bit precarious, but I I'm not going to second guess what you wrote. So, that's more in sort of that area. And then the other broad area we've got, we're just sort of calling geopolitics and telecoms, because a few stories, none of which overlap exactly, but all of which cover how politics affects telecoms. One was one I wrote earlier on this week, which was, so we know that like Donald Trump's been hiring all these randos to be in his cabinet.
You have to like McDonald's, don't you, to work in Donald Trump's
Yeah.
cabinet?
Well, there was a hilarious photo of them on a plane eating McDonald's with RFK Jr., who's like, my body is a temple. Someone on a podcast, I heard there was a joke associated with that. They were saying it's like when someone joins a gang and they make them do drugs to prove they're not a Fed.
Or they have to kill someone.
Yeah, exactly. They like to prove his allegiance, he had to eat a Big
But
Mac.
also, can I just say, to eat McDonald's, you have to eat it like within minutes.
Yeah, why they're sitting on a plane with it. They've already been sitting and
they've probably got a special little oven or something.
It would have been stale, and even though reheated doesn't work.
They've probably got a McDonald's on the plane.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, McDonald's won. Yeah, well, especially since Trump did that stunt just before the election, he's probably got lifetime fucking free burgers now.
I wonder what McDonald's thinks about this. They're like,
I bet they love it.
They're ecstatic.
I mean,
they've had 2 bits of incredibly high-profile earned media from Donald Trump.
yeah, but then you can't
including a guy who
alienate the
makes
other
stuff
side.
about
though.
health stuff. Eating
But
things.
it's polarizing, so they don't want to alienate the entire other half of the audience.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see your point there. Yeah, well, that's the danger of.
I think
anything
the other
with
half of the audience, large sections of them, will be able to put aside their differences over a Big Mac.
Well, apparently it was just like
they won't hold it against them.
it was just like a franchise. McDonald's had nothing to do with it. They just picked a franchise. The owner of the franchise said,
Right.
you can use it.
Yeah, but the brand association's still there.
Yeah, of course.
And McDonald's still spends millions on above the line advertising, which is franchisees, because presumably the way franchises work is McDonald's gets a piece of the action, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I think it's like 40% or something.
40%. There we go. Anyway, so one of the less wacky appointees that he's announced is a chap called Brendan Carr to be the next chair of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is their Ofcom. A la last week.
Well, I think it has more powers than Ofcom, doesn't it? I think it does some of the stuff that the CMA would do, for instance, to do.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, I may have that wrong, but I think when
there's the
M&A
FTC as well, and there's sometimes
there
a bit
is.
of overlap there. FTC, Federal Trade Commission, seems to be more proactive, especially under the current administration, where they had this woman called Lena Khan, and she's really into like trust busting and all that sort of thing. In fact, while we're talking about American stuff, we might mention that some judge has said that Google's got to start selling itself off, and that was news that was breaking late yesterday, early today. Anyway, so Brendan Carr, and I think it's really interesting. He's already a commissioner. He's going to be the chairman, and he's got really strong feelings about things like censorship and Section 230. So that's interesting to chat about. There's also talking about sort of US and as it affects more the technology, broader technology rather than just telecoms world. There's something I wrote late last week about how Applied Materials, who's one of the companies that supplies semiconductor manufacturing equipment, is forecasting a drop off in sales because it's not allowed to do some stuff in China anymore, and that just feeds into. It's not that dramatic by itself. It just feeds into the sort of collateral damage narrative that I've been speaking about for a while.
Yeah.
I.e., it's all very well America trying to suppress the Chinese tech sector, but it is damaging a lot of its own companies by doing it.
It is. It's funny, isn't it? Because these sort of not loopholes really, but there's always something else it seems they can find to do.
Yeah, and
you were thinking, wasn't Applied Materials already cut off from selling a lot of this equipment? But apparently not. And,
apparently not. And if you look at a chart that I took from where is it? Seeking Alpha, and linked and attributed accordingly. Like as recently as 3 quarters ago, there was about 3 or 4 times as much. Yeah, there was like in the financial Q1 of 24, which I think is earlier than calendar Q1 24. It was it was more than 3 times as much, almost 4 times as much sales to China as US.
Well, I did
material.
that table on chip sales to China from American companies, and it's incredible how much was still being sold even after some of these sanctions have been introduced. So
it does feel, as well as in terms of the effectiveness, it does feel like they're shutting the door, the stable door after the horse has bolted a bit. And then one last thing in terms of geopolitics and telecoms, not related to China, but in this case Russia. Bunch more undersea cables have been cut in the Baltic, and most people reckon it's the Russians' fault. So we'll cover all that. So that's a fair bit. It's a bit of a mishmash.
Putin got his deep sea diving gear.
Putin, yeah, exactly.
Went down there with his judo skills and his
karate chopped a cable. So there we are. So why don't we start? I'll sort of hand it over to you because you've been doing much more writing this week, and Light Reading covered it before we did.
I think Mike covered it before anybody, to be honest.
Right, you covered it very early.
I think Mike covered the story before Bloomberg got hold of it.
All right, nice one, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me find that headline. I actually haven't got that one open. Well, anyway.
I don't normally like questions in headlines. I think we've talked about this before,
Yes.
but I think in that case it was actually okay.
Well,
because if someone's asking the question, it's attention grabbing, and why would they be, sort of thing.
To clarify my position on that, I don't like question headlines when it's your own conjecture. I think then you're sitting on the fence too much. You're not backing your own conjecture. But this isn't Mike's own conjecture, it's someone else's. So the headline was, will T-Mobile give Nokia the boot too? Over to you, Ian. Why don't you sum up this story?
Yeah, so why the sort of the give the boot to double O?
The
reason for that is going back 1 year, pretty much exactly 1 year. I think it was early December. There was this fairly dramatic decision by AT&T to award a Open RAN, inverted commas, deal to Ericsson worth 14 billion over a number of years. And as a consequence of that, it seemed, even though Open RAN's supposed to be about supply diversity and having more vendors in your network, they'd actually be taking out Nokia, which I think was supplying equipment to a third of their sites. I can't remember the site numbers now, but you're talking tens of thousands. And just basically replace that Nokia equipment with Ericsson. And it's really bad, obviously very, very bad news for Nokia on the kind of mobile network side of things, because I think they were deriving I think their own estimates were saying about 5% to 8% of revenues coming from AT&T. I mean, they're huge companies. The US operators are really, really important to the big kit vendors in the Nordic countries, because for a start, they're very big. And they also just seem to spend more. I get the feeling the prices are higher.
Didn't you once? Was it you or was it a guest? Characterise it as the US subsidising.
It was a guest whose name we can't mention because he said it afterwards in the pub off the record. But there was some speculation. So you can go after overall our guests. Someone really wants.
Right, one of our guests in the pub after said that basically the US is subsidising our cheap telecoms here.
Yeah. Because they make all their profits in the US is basically in a nutshell,
and then make
suggesting.
Fuck all margin,
and they don't really make any. I mean, some markets. If you talk about markets like India, I've heard it said by analysts that they hardly make anything at all.
Yeah.
It's almost like, why are they even bothering in India? Because they're almost having to pay to do it. It's that bad. Whereas, and then in Europe, somewhere in the middle, basically.
Yeah.
The problem with Europe at the moment, of course, is no one's really spending anything. It seems. We've got this arguably this problem of too many operating companies across a geography of whatever it is, 500 million people, or probably more if you include all of Europe and not just the EU. So it's I'm not saying I completely go along with all the arguments, but yeah, it looks kind of inefficient, and this gets to the Vodafone 3 merger that's going on in the UK at the moment. That's likely to be approved, I think, with some remedies. One of their big cases they've made for that is that it would spur investment activity. They've made this promise to sort of put money into a 5G network, and it looks like the remedy will be that it will go ahead, but they'll sort of get held to account somehow on what they're spending. I don't know how easily they can police that. I was looking at some of the documents this morning. But yeah, back to the topic. The US is really important for Ericsson and Nokia. You've only got 3 big operators there. Giant companies, always like loads and loads of customers, all spend massive amounts in capex each year compared with.
Yeah, I mean, they must all have like a
operators
subscriber
elsewhere.
base of like 100 million plus.
Yeah, they're huge. There's only really one other player that's Dish, and Dish Network's not
They're
really
having a bit of a
going.
mare.
I think they're sort of in danger of bankruptcy, aren't they, basically? And it seems like it's been that way for a while.
It's been precarious for a while.
Yeah, I mean, that would be maybe what you call a genuine Open RAN network, where they've really kind of gone to town with it and not only
Greenfield and all
not just said it actually have the specs there, but use as many different players as they can, it seems. And I don't know if you can blame their problems specifically on that, but it sounds like a difficult thing to try and manage. But the AT&T move with Ericsson was obviously really, really bad news for Nokia. Like, it sent its share price down quite badly. There was lots of management calls about it. They were reaching out to the media. It was it's kind of a bad thing. If you go back a few years before that to 2019, 2020 timeframe, sort of early days of 5G rollout, which some people might have forgotten about, Verizon, which is a big kind of customer of Nokia, made a similarly kind of dramatic decision to not give the 5G work that it wanted to doing to Nokia, but to Samsung instead. And it was really big. I think they attached a value to the contract. It was, multi billions, like the Ericsson one over a few years. So you're thinking, well, Nokia's already lost out with Verizon. Then this AT&T move comes along. It's basically been left with T-Mobile US. And as I understand it, it's got about 50%, I think. It's kind of an even split between Ericsson and Nokia.
So that's a good chunk of change.
This research note comes out, which is the news this week, from a guy called Earl Lum, who's...
I saw it on LinkedIn. Was that that looks like the whole research note. It's quite detailed and it's got photos of kit.
It's very
and all
detailed. And he seems to put his research notes up on LinkedIn.
Fair enough.
He has a company called EJL Wireless Research, which I'm sure does.
I wonder what the J stands for.
Yeah, I do as well. But we can ask him at some point, maybe. I mean, I do know him, so we can,
But the first name like Earl, I want it to be more interesting. Can't be James.
Yeah. But he's presumably selling, reports that you have to pay for and that aren't going out on LinkedIn, and he's doing advice for companies. I've known him. I know him better now in the last sort of year than I used to, but I've dealt with him for sort of 2 or 3 years. And as I understand it, he's got kind of a deep background in the chip sector. He really knows his stuff on semiconductors. And what he tends to do is, he's been doing this for years. He kind of takes equipment to pieces. He sort of does these teardowns.
Yeah.
But you get these companies that do smartphone teardowns, and they go, oh, look, there's a 7 nanometer chip there from TSMC. How have they got hold of that?
Tech Insights did one of those, and it raised all sorts of hell because it looked like China was better at chips than they're supposed to be.
So he does that with base station equipment, basically. He does it with radio units and with the kind of baseband stuff as well.
Good niche he's got.
Yeah, and he's very highly respected, and he clearly, talking to him, he really obviously knows his stuff. He's a real expert in the area, and he's the reason that you sort of have to pay attention to him as well, not just because he's a really credible analyst, is he was the guy who got wind of the fact that AT&T was going to replace Nokia. So go back Ericsson. 1 year, it was Earl Lum who basically broke that story. He called it. Again, hat tip to Mike Dana, my colleague, because I know he knows Earl as well, but he got to both the stories really very quickly. Yeah. I mean, we could say maybe he got a heads up. I don't know, but we can speculate.
We couldn't possibly, even if we knew, we couldn't reveal.
Yeah, but he I think Mike beat everybody to that one, and it was Earl's research that sort of underpinned it. And then what Earl's done with this research note, which I think you've seen and probably read bits of, and I've gone through, very, very detailed, is he's speculating that there's a good chance that T-Mobile might do the same thing and take Nokia out. And we can go into the reasons.
Well, I think it is interesting because, I mean, over that, obviously, this is all conjecture. However expert and well informed Earl Lum is, it's still conjecture.
Yeah.
But I think some of his rationale was interesting, and it's not something I'd really thought about that much. I don't really. You probably do it more than I do. I've never really got into the guts of a radio and thought about all those components.
Well, I'm getting into them more now because I'm better. I think I'm better on the baseband side.
Right.
Through my sort of Open RAN and virtual RAN stuff to do with Intel and acceleration and
You've been hot on the chips for a couple of years, haven't you?
Well, that's not that. All that's on the baseband unit
Yes.
side, like the DU and everything.
Yeah, to do with Open RAN
when it comes to
and
the
general
RU,
purpose.
I'm more sort of in the.
Fair enough. Okay, well
I'm more of a novice.
we can guide each other
But
through
I'm
it then.
trying to get up to speed on it, and obviously people like Earl help because
Yeah, well,
he knows it really well. But
So Earl very much led in his LinkedIn. In fact, we linked to his LinkedIn, so I'm gonna go to that. His LinkedIn post can be found here. Let's not paraphrase. Don't pass me one yet. I'm drinking slower than you because I've got to be on my best
I'm drinking
behaviour.
pretty slowly. I mean, this is only my second one.
I know, but I'm just saying This
just feel like
is taking stupendous
It's
self-restraint.
like a continuous stream
for
of
me to
alcohol
drink this
really
slowly.
going down me at the moment since lunchtime yesterday.
Your body's just going, oh, all right, here we go again. And he goes, so his headline of his LinkedIn post is, could Nokia be kicked out of T-Mobile USA and will lightning strike 3 times? And then he goes as basically a subhead, to sum it up, 10 plus years of disappointment and the dislike of fans. And it's the dislike of fans that I found
That's the big
interesting.
theme in the research note.
And so I'll paraphrase it, and then you feel free to sort of dig deeper. I'll give like the top line. So there are lots of sort of active components and bits of machinery and chips and bits and bobs that have to make a radio work. And obviously radios use up a fair bit of power, chucking out those radio waves that can cover
they use
loads of
a lot more
kilometres.
power, by the way, than the baseband units.
Right.
We always make a fuss about Intel x86 not being that
That's supposed to
energy
ARM architecture
efficient.
or
But if
whatever.
you talk to people who push back on that a bit, they go, well, yeah, it's only about 10% of the total.
Yes.
It's also the radio units that are actually using most
and a
of the
lot of it will
power.
just be the whacking out the actual radio waves, won't it?
Yeah.
Because they've got to go a long way, and they've got to be able to populate lots of people's phones at once.
Yeah.
And so anytime, just like with a laptop or something like that, anytime you've got all this stuff going on, you need some cooling. And you look at, for example, Pierre's MacBook he's got there, that's all passive cooling. That's got no fans or vents or anything.
I mean, that's a really good analogy, I think.
It has 2 fans in.
Oh, it does have fans?
But Ian's
I think
newer ones then. Ones that use
the less powerful ones don't have a fan, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the analogy that you're
MacBook Airs.
drawing, which is, I think if I was going to try and write this up in detail, I'd try and maybe use that. The switch that the MacBooks made from using these, I always keep mentioning Intel, I hate it.
Well, they did
but
used
they
to have
were
Intel
Intel
chips,
and then they moved to their own silicon that they'd done based
The
on
M series
designs. They're up to M2.
Yeah, and they're
they're
ARM architecture.
Yeah, and there's no like fan inside the machine anymore.
No, well, there is in Pierre's apparently.
On the you've heard it actually before.
Yeah, but not in my.
But certainly the latest MacBook Airs are all passively cooled, which basically means
all the iPads, the iPhones.
Yes, of course,
it's
iPads and
convection
iPhones.
that's cooling it.
Convection cooling, yeah, and in all mobile devices. And so basically you've still got a chip. Like you might sometimes notice it on your phone if it's doing something quite graphics intensive like streaming video or playing a game or something, you'll notice your phone get warmer because all chips do produce heat.
Yeah.
And so the critical cutoff point is, can you manage that heat such that it doesn't get above a certain bad temperature? Like, do you remember, God, years ago there was that Samsung phone that started fucking blowing up in people's pockets.
Yeah.
So let's say the maximum temperature the inside of a given thing can be is, let's say, I don't know, 40 degrees centigrade for the sake of argument. That still seems a bit hot, much hotter than body temperature. You'd think it gets a bit uncomfortable. I'm giving a bit of headroom. Let's say it's 40 degrees. And if you're able to basically guarantee in any normal environment that the temperature in the inside of this device, thanks to the chip, which is the main heat generator, won't get above 40 degrees, then you can stick to what we call passive or convection cooling, where the heat just dissipates naturally through the body of the thing. And then if it's not like a typical, like my Dell laptop here or for example, my PC at home, they've got great big fans on them and they whir away because they're doing a lot of graphics processing and they've got great big fat NVIDIA or AMD graphics cards in them. And so this kind of applies to these radio units as well. And I guess the passive cooling will use, and this you sometimes get this in gaming laptops as well, like heat fins. Basically high surface area, very conductive bits of metal that can easily dissipate the heat and take it into the air. But then if they don't work, then you've got to have fans. And I think that's my understanding of what Earl Lum's referring to.
Yeah.
Is that, I'll hand it to you now.
I think you described it really well. I mean,
Okay.
there's almost not a lot to add to it. But yeah, he's
stolen your thunder.
I mean, as I say, this is not my area of expertise, but his point is that he thinks there's an issue with the Nokia radio units.
Yeah.
And this is something he actually raised when AT&T made its decision to switch from Nokia to Ericsson. I think he brought this up then, that he thought there was a concern about you look at the Nokia portfolio compared with the Ericsson portfolio, and it didn't seem as strong because of this issue of fans. He thinks that they're much more heavily reliant on these fans than their big rivals, and then that's a concern because of these issues to do with power consumption and having to have these, a sort of active cooling element in there.
But there is a plus side to fans, which is that you don't have to have those big metal fin heat dissipators. So in principle, am I understanding this correctly?
Totally.
That having fans should mean a lighter unit, which has its advantages.
Yeah, exactly. So this is only his point, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think one thing Nokia hasn't done yet, even though, we should say, by the way, I think you said it's conjecture, and it is conjecture. Yeah. When he came out with his research note, what very quickly happened was, there was a drop in the share price, which isn't surprising because if they lose T-Mobile as a customer, it's pretty bad.
They're out of North America, pretty much.
Well, they're in Canada.
Oh, they're in Canada, right.
But I think even in Canada, like we're looking at Telus, for instance, which I think shares its network anyway with Rogers doing this Open RAN move where they're moving quite heavily towards Samsung, and they don't seem very keen on using. They want to use virtual RAM, but they don't want to use inline cards, which is a question mark over Nokia because they don't do anything else but that on their. And
I'd imagine if you say that North America is just US and Canada, which I've always thought is a bit weird because it should be Mexico as well.
Yeah,
but a lot of people don't count that. No. They say that's Latin America.
Well, the Mexican market in terms of vendor makeup, I've no idea.
Right,
but I know Huawei is supposed to be everywhere in Latin America.
Well, they are. Yeah. No, they are as they are in the Middle East, as they are in Africa.
So you look at the Americas and you lose the US, and then there's probably not.
So I was going to say, if it's just if you're one of these people that say North America is just the English speaking part, then I imagine US is like 9/10 of the equation.
Yeah, and in terms of what it means economically as well, because you look at the size of the country population-wise, it's 350 million? I don't know, 400 million.
Canada's
got like 5 people in it. So,
5 people and a polar bear.
Yeah. So, some weird wildlife further north. But So it would be bad, and therefore, when the story came out, it was really one of those stories that moves the market. I think their share price went down like 7%. It's come up again since because they responded quite quickly with an on-the-record statement about being well in with T-Mobile, basically. And I think T-Mobile had its own comment saying we have no intention of replacing Nokia at the moment.
I'll come back to you on that because Mary, writing up for us, got some of their... Because we wrote it later than Mike.
Right.
Perhaps we got some of the more long-tail reaction that he didn't get it by being so quick. I'd be
interested in hearing that.
Okay. Let's find it.
But he, while you're looking for it, I mean, they came out with this response. Again, it's all conjecture. The indications, by the way, leading up to this research note have been that T-Mobile's been very, very happy with both its radio vendors, with Ericsson and Nokia. I mean, they've made quite glowing comments about them throughout the course of the year. They're both involved in this AI RAN stuff that they're trying to do that also involves NVIDIA. They're kind of in discussions on that. We should also say if you take the North Americans out of the picture, Nokia is very big in other parts of the world still. I mean, they're winning business.
Well, that's part of their response.
They're right. So they're very. It would be slightly strange in a way if this was such a big issue. Why aren't other telcos going?
I think that's not a bad rebuttal. So I'll read out what Mary got from Nokia on this. A quote from their spokesperson, or from their published statement, or whatever it was. In response to some recent analyst claims, Nokia states that these comments mainly relate to its first-generation 5G products designed in 2018. Since then, strong investment in R&D, system-on-chip technology, and new product launches have positioned Nokia as one of the market leaders globally. This is visible in the customer contracts we've recently won, increasing our market share in many regions, including India, Japan, Brazil, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Right. So that's their counter.
Yeah, and I think it's a good counter because if you take China, where Ericsson and Nokia, neither of them do very well there now. It all goes to Huawei and ZTE. They actually used to have a bit of a bigger presence a few years ago, but it's one of those tit-for-tat things, I think, that the Chinese government have done.
Chinese kept a little bit of Ericsson there just to show...
that they diversified, But,
and then they're not even bothering with that
anymore. It's hardly anything, and so they're not really players in that market. If you take North America out of the picture, where they've had these setbacks with Verizon and more recently AT&T, there is actually a case that they make, and I know there's some analyst support for this, that they've grown market share recently. They've had some successes in some of these other markets. I mean, the issue, I guess, for them from a business perspective is how lucrative those markets are. Because the US is so important. This is why it freaks everybody out. If there's even the suggestion they might lose the last remaining big US operator they've got as a customer, then everybody goes into a bit of a flap about it. And that's where I think their share price is still down on where it was earlier in the week.
I'll have a butcher's.
About 4% down, I think, maybe 5%. Nokia.
Yeah, they are.
Right. So it
Pierre just knows if they're in his portfolio.
No, they're not.
Oh, okay. So you just know anyway because you're such a geek.
Yeah, they used to be, so I keep an eye to see if I did well or not.
Shall I look at their Helsinki listing?
Yeah, I need to check the share price in the New York.
Oh, actually, no. So it plunged on the news, and then it recovered a bit, and it's actually lower than the plunge on the news now.
Oh, is it?
So it's actually dropped off like today and yesterday.
Right.
Back to
it's different. It's different in Helsinki then.
It's back to mid-October.
Yeah, so that's Helsinki. So Helsinki for the week, Helsinki is down 7.3%. Shall I have a look
but
at...
still, over the last 6 months, they're still quite up.
At New York.
They're up 10% over 6 months.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the last 6 months, are we? And yeah, New York, actually, it's done better. But this makes it there, pre-market. So pre-market, New York's going to follow Helsinki. So New York, where the market doesn't seem to have opened, at least according to Google Finance at the time of recording, this is on Thursday the 21st, was down 5% over the week, but then it's down in pre-market 3.5%.
Yeah.
So that's following Helsinki.
Right.
So something else is going on. It's almost like, I'd like to say it's this pod, but we obviously haven't published it yet.
No.
But something else is going on. Maybe people are having a third look at what Earl Lum said and going, oh shit, perhaps there is something to worry about.
The Earl Lum thing is going to take some unpicking and some analysis. And I think, you said it really well, that there do seem to be pros and cons of fans. The downside is you're having to introduce this element because you can't deal with it through convection, and the people who don't like fans, and Earl Lum seems to be one of them. He seems to be quite negative about the use of fans whatsoever. Is that you basically just don't want them there at all. They're a sort of an additive cost, if you like, and an element,
and another bit of energy consumption.
Yeah, and he also seems to think that US operators haven't been very happy with fans, and there's a big.
They're not fans of them.
They're not fans of fans. Yeah, I think he's put that in his research note a few times, but he seems to think that there's a push at the US operators, possibly now including T-Mobile, I think, according to some of his sources, where they've been putting pressure on Nokia to move away from having fans, and yet there's still there's still radio units with fans there.
Yeah, go on.
And the point is that what I think it would be nice to hear from on Nokia's side, rather than they've put out their official statements, they've put out their the supporting comment from T-Mobile, but it'd be quite interesting for them to make a case for why it doesn't see these fans, because he's made such a big thing about
why it doesn't see it as an issue.
Why it doesn't? Because
although that when I just read out seemed to be them more going, oh, that's our old shit, our new shit isn't like that. Are they saying the new shit doesn't have fans?
Well, I think they have a portfolio that has a mix of products where there are fans in some and there are not fans in others. I know that for a fact.
Okay.
Now, the question is, how much is that used in the T-Mobile base, and how many of the products that they've designed for the US market, I guess, are without fans, and are people actually demand? There's a lot of questions that sort of really need to be analysed, I think. And as I say, it's all very much conjectural that T-Mobile is about to kind of dump them. Because the other thing you've got to remember is, if T-Mobile does dump them, what does it do? It's a huge swap out job to do this stuff. What are they going to be another operator that goes, Ericsson, come along and take out all of this equipment and replace it with your equipment? And would Ericsson be in a position to do that?
And we normally expect big upgrade cycles to largely follow the Gs, don't we?
We do, and I think one of the things about the AT&T move is that there was a lot of concern, and I've heard people say this hasn't really showed up yet, actually, on the cost side in Ericsson financials. That Ericsson was taking on a lot of cost to do. When you swap out another vendor, this isn't controversial. This is accepted. When you swap out another vendor, it's not a very profitable business at first, because you're just basically replacing stuff.
Yeah.
Where there's still some depreciation costs. Someone's going to bear that cost.
Indeed.
It's either going to be the telco.
If you haven't sweated the asset to the max. then on the balance sheet you've got to account for that.
Yeah, so if there's a lot of T-Mobile, Nokia equipment in the T-Mobile estate that they were to then go and remove, and it hasn't fully depreciated, then it's the same question as it happened at AT&T, and then again they're an operator in a position where they're reliant on solely on one vendor. Maybe they could look at introducing somebody else, but what are your options? There aren't really that many. I mean, the only one really that we can think of is probably Samsung, yeah? I suspect. If you look
You mean apart from Ericsson?
Apart from Ericsson, yeah, that's available, that could do things on a scale basis
that scale,
in the US is probably Samsung. And, and as I say, all the indications are that they've actually been quite happy with Nokia as a supplier. So I think it's an interesting one to watch. It's an interesting research note he's put out. There's a lot there to unpick. I think it'd be nice to have Nokia giving a bit more of its sort of view on why it doesn't think when he said that fans are such an issue and he's making such a big strong case against them, let's try and hear someone who's prepared to put the case that you made very in a sentence. It'd be nice to hear someone who does this stuff actually come out and say, well, yeah, and
something
also this and this, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to cover the comms side, which you were just touching on there a little bit more. But before I do we know that that Ericsson stuff generally doesn't have fans? Yeah, we know that.
Yeah, Ericsson says its equipment that it's selling at the moment doesn't have fans. Any of it.
And do we know that accordingly it's heavier than Nokia equipment with fans? Because that was supposed to be the trade-off.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question to do, and maybe that's something that Earl himself would have a view on, and I'm sure that there's probably products you can compare and look at the stats. But my perception is that Ericsson's always been pretty bullish on the weight of its radio units.
Yeah, remember, you had that photo of a young woman carrying 2 radio units to show how light they were.
Yeah, exactly. And so they claim that they've been able to miniaturise these radio units and remove and not have to use fans. And they've managed to cut out enough material, including those fins you're talking about. God, there's fins doing fins and fans, and there's the Swedes just doing fins, yeah?
Oh, and there's a headline here.
I mean, there is a headline opportunity in this story somewhere. But...
Fins drop fins because they're fans of fans. How about that? There we are. That's why I get the big bucks.
But so... They say their stuff's really lightweight, even though it's not using these fans. It's incredibly lightweight, and they've pared it down, and they've got these, as you said, these women walking along rooftops carrying
just
them like
swinging them around
bags,
their head,
like Selfridges bags, and
holding them with a pinky.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I don't know. I think that'd be a really interesting one to dig into in itself. The weight, because the weight actually carries cost simply because you need more people or you need more equipment to move it into place.
Yeah, and you need to
reinforce the steel.
Yeah, in principle, spend more on the mounting and all that.
So the actual weight is kind of quite critical.
And above a certain weight, you need 2 people.
You need exactly. Well, that's
or
that's
more,
the argument.
More
you just
people,
need more equipment, I think, to do it. And
I mean, I haven't read all of Earl's thing, and I don't know if you recall whether or not he addressed that, because
he might have done.
Because if he's saying fans are bad, he must be saying why fans are bad.
Yeah. Well, I think his view is that he views them as a kind of additive cost,
right?
And that the energy
points to an inefficiency.
Is they're very power consumptive, and ideally you shouldn't really be having them. And by the way, I do have a comment from Ericsson on fans that I can read out because it's on the record.
Cool.
Because they're quite sort of.
Isn't it a thing also like you want them to be small so that it takes less space on the mast?
I mean, I think we can all agree if you can cool passively, then do it. But if the trade-off is that in order to cool passively, you've got to have these massive, heavy heat fins.
Presumably, it depends on where you deploy as well.
Well, yeah, but wherever you're going to do it, it's either... Yeah, well, I was wondering about climate, actually, because when I was looking at that list of wins that Nokia's got, I noticed quite a lot of them are in hot countries, but then parts of America are fucking hot.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily apply there. But, yeah, you'd think that maybe there's some climates
Minnesota versus Arizona is very different.
Whereas passive cooling in northern Canada is going to be a piece of piss, isn't it? Anyway, so you were going to read out your...
I mean, these were...
Or in Finland, for that matter.
These were comments that were not provided on background or off the record. So,
Okay, hopefully.
well, it's from Adam, who's the main PR guy.
Adam.
Yeah, and they weren't. They're happy for these to be quoted on.
Yeah.
I think. So, while fans can be used to enhance cooling and potentially reduce the size and weight of a product's design, Scott, spot on. They come with notable trade-offs, including increased power consumption and a lower mean time between failures, which is capitalised MTBF.
Okay, so there's more to go wrong. Is my one word syllable?
Right? And then the next sentence, based on our experience, fans are typically used only when a product cannot be adequately cooled through convection alone.
Well, yeah. I mean, no offence, Adam, but duh. I mean, that stands to reason, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess, but. I mean, the weight thing I think is interesting, and this is why I think it would be really good to have Nokia sort of put its case more strongly on the fan side, because you've got an analyst there who's made such a big deal of fans. The theme of his research,
and he's got loads of photos
fans,
of the backs of radios with vents,
and he knows his stuff. It'd be really nice to have them sort of talk about, And by the way, Nokia has products in its range that don't have fans.
Yeah, and I think Alam did make that point.
Yeah,
I thought real estate was more important than actual weight. Like being able to put more on one mast is
well, I think the weight's important because the steel needs reinforcing once you get heavier radio units there. Because some of them, because you're talking kilogram weight differences. They have to spend. That's the case that the operators have made, that you have to spend more on, and also just manoeuvring them into position. The whole rollout job costs more because of the
cherry
equipment you need. So I think the weight's quite critical in that point. The thing they're really concerned about when they're up there and running, and you've dealt with all those points, is doing it and keeping your running costs down. And if you've got a fan that's burning loads of energy, then that's going to be a concern, I guess. But I don't know. I mean,
energy's a massive theme in telecoms these days as well.
There's different ways of looking at this, I think.
Also, if it's like a heat wave and the fan fails, then it can ruin the entire thing.
I guess so. These fans are bloody good at not failing. Really? Very industrial grade.
But I mean, if I was gonna sort of question Earl's stuff, and I think it's spot on technically, and he knows his stuff.
Yeah.
His sort of aversion to fans, his feeling that US operators don't want fans. I think that's the thing that kind of needs
fleshing out a bit
more than anything, because if fans are such a problem, I mean, the characteristics of the US market, you guys were just talking about temperatures and stuff while I was looking up that.
You got like
comment.
Seattle versus Phoenix. This is a massive difference.
Those conditions are quite similar in other parts of the world, other regions where Nokia's products that do have fans in would be used, presumably. So I think this notion that fans are always an issue is something that needs testing, and the test of that is to have somebody who supports fans going on the record about it, I think.
And maybe there's another consideration with passive cooling, which is maybe you have to mount it differently and have more space for airflow around the back of the thing, so that the heat can dissipate. So you couldn't have stuff next to each other, or the passive cooling would fail. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things.
Just on the, I was just going to say on the market dynamics, because I think you one of the reasons you thought this would be a good topic to talk about is if something like that did happen, by the way, and there's no hint of it happening, but if let's say T-Mobile did move away from Nokia, I think we're in a disastrous situation.
In terms of competitivenely.
I just think it would be so bad for the industry for something like that to happen, because you've then got a US market that's
which is like got one and
so
a half
heavily
vendors,
reliant on Ericsson. It would be like 1.5 vendors. You've got a bit of Samsung in with Verizon. Okay, a bit. I think it's about 40,000 sites. It's quite a
and as we might get onto,
maybe
Open RAN hasn't turned out to be the market diversifying thing that they hoped it would be.
Exactly. I mean, Ericsson can make and AT&T can talk up their deal as much as they want as an Open RAN deal. But the fact is, it's not really. Let's be honest. It's you've got some specs in there, some compliance. You're using some virtualization technologies, but you're very, very heavily reliant on one supplier. And there might be some Fujitsu radios in there, and maybe you can introduce another one in future. But that's very much a single vendor deal from my perspective. And if T-Mobile did something similar, and then you've got Verizon using both Ericsson and Samsung, you've got a US market that's so reliant on Ericsson. By the way, did you notice this week Bloomberg's reporting that Boy Ekham's saying he might relocate to
I saw someone
very interesting, the context of this stuff that's going on at the moment.
And so I took that, I just skimmed it, because I think, again, it was a Bloomberg thing, and I don't have a subscription to Bloomberg, so I wasn't able to click through and read the meat of it. But what I took from it was him basically signalling to Europe, he's going, look, if this keeps up, I might have to fuck off to America. And presumably he's meaning it as a shot across the bows at this stage. To just Europe, can you just lower the bureaucratic burden and just, at least try and compete with America in terms of being a pro-business environment? That's what I took from it. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably sticking his neck out a bit and being a bit cheeky, sort of, let's put some pressure on. It's hard to imagine that Ericsson, a Swedish company that's probably one of the most important companies to the country, along with IKEA, sort of doing something like that. But yeah, I mean, if they got other T-Mobile business as well as all the business they've now won with AT&T and the stuff they do with Verizon, they're kind of pretty much reliant.
As it
on
is now, I
US
think they get
almost,
more. I'm trying to remember
profits.
from their last quarterlies. I think they get almost as much revenue from America as they do all of Europe and Latin America combined, because they've got a block of Europe and Latin America, haven't they?
Yeah, which I think is to do with
Telefonica. Yeah. And maybe the geezer in charge is Hispanic and he just fancies it.
Yeah.
But yeah, America obviously as a single country is by far their most important single country.
Yeah.
And so yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. But it's not good for Europe, is it?
No.
If something like that were to happen.
No, well, I mean, maybe we'll dip back into that when we get into our sort of geopolitics thing. But, I was listening to a podcast about sort of Germany's economic condition right now, and that's not too rosy. There's a bit of stuff going on, even leaving aside a bit of Brexit leaver Schadenfreude. I obviously don't want Europe to struggle.
No.
But anyway, we might get back to that. Just a couple of last things I want to say on the Nokia one before we move on from there, to do with comms. So I take your point about addressing it more fully than they did. It wasn't a bad response, but it wasn't detailed. It wasn't granular. And then I think T-Mobile, the T-Mobile one was, T-Mobile works with both Nokia and Ericsson and Iran, who have helped us over the years, blah, 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 blah. We continue to work with them on ensuring our customers have the best. So more of that just word salad, PR bollocks.
Yeah.
There wasn't anything very conclusive in that, other than the concluding sentence, which said, "We have made no decision to end our working relationship with Nokia.
Well. Yeah.
Any reports in the media implying this are untrue." Well, we have made no decision, as Mary said, is not a rebuttal. It's just saying we haven't decided yet.
I did notice that as well.
That's why
it doesn't rule it out. It says they've not come out and gone, we're never replacing Nokia. They wouldn't say that anyway, I guess. No telco is going to say that. So
put them in a bit of a shit negotiating position, wouldn't it?
It would. So then I suppose they're not going to say that. And I think they've always been. They've been really sort of full of praise, actually, I think, for Nokia this year and the products they get. But what it needs...
And I'm sure Nokia's products are very good, by the way.
Nokia's not going to put out a statement, by the way, going into details on fans. What it takes is for somebody who's quite senior on the Nokia side, who knows about this stuff, to do an interview with a journalist.
Like Tommy used to work on the docks.
Someone like that, and sort of put their case across. And by the way... There's this title called Light Reading. We do that sort of thing. So if they want us to do it...
No, let Telecoms.com come to us. Okay. No, you would do a better job than we would. And then just one other thing I want to make. This is more just a little PR niggle. Immediately after this, they sent out a press release saying that they just won a big 5G deal with Bharti Airtel in India. And the quote is, it's a multi-year, multi-billion extension deal to deploy 4G and 5G equipment across key Indian cities and states. My issue is with multi-billion. When you see that it's a multi-billion extension deal, what do you conclude from that, Ian?
Multi-billion extension deal?
Yeah.
I didn't even think about it that much.
It's more than one.
Yeah, but what does the billion refer to?
Bolts and nuts.
Well, exactly. This is the point. They don't qualify.
Rupees.
Well, it might be, or it might be dollars, or it might be
much.
nuts and bolts. I think that's the point. I think the assumption is it probably is rupees, which is why they didn't say it. If it was dollars, they probably would have said it.
Yeah.
And so this is just a little niggle. They sent out a thing, and I read the press release several times to make sure that I wasn't just being petty. They never qualify that multi-billion, and that's deliberate.
Right.
And I think that's a little bit sneaky. they're trying to infer something other than rupees. They're trying to infer dollars or euros.
These are the sort of the dark arts of PR, aren't they? Really,
Exactly.
It's like when everybody's claiming to be Vietel's like main supplier in Vietnam, and I think Nokia did it and Ericsson did it.
Yes,
and
I remember
they were all building our own stuff, and now it's
they were
like,
having a pissing competition.
What's going on here?
Yeah.
You're talking about a specific region or specific tech. It's very hard to.
Indeed. So I'm just
sometimes.
calling you out on that, Nokia. That's some sneaky press release writing, and I don't approve. And then it blows back in your face because then you get RC journalists like our Mary calling out on it.
Yeah.
So don't treat us like we're stupid. Right. Moving on, Ian. This is the first chunk of this is quite a light reading, heavy one, which is totally fair enough because you deserve it. Mike wrote a piece yesterday saying the plummeting value of 5G millimeter wave spectrum. So it's interesting. It's one of those headlines that isn't actually a typical headline, which is, noun does verb. He's just making a statement, an absolute statement, rather than reporting a piece of news.
Yeah. It's like a novel title.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, I haven't read it, but obviously, whatever Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T spent on millimeter wave spectrum they probably paid too much in terms of how useful it's been subsequently. And we've spoken in the past, and we've certainly both written about Verizon. Do you remember Verizon went really heavy on its millimeter wave?
Yeah.
And and our ongoing snide comment is you need to be sat on a base station to be able to get it because the propagation characteristics are so bad. In other words, it doesn't penetrate buildings, doesn't even get very far. It's just not ideal spectrum. The flip side is there's lots of it. And so he wrote that. And then what seems to slightly overlap with it is one that you wrote this morning, which is quite dramatic. It says Mavenir risk default or restructuring after failure to crack 5G. So the reason the two are linked, apart from the fact they're both on light reading, is that they both seem to concern people betting heavily on 5G and it not paying off.
Yeah.
So why don't you, I haven't read it fully and you only just wrote and published it. Why don't you tell us about the Mavenir one and we'll see how it links to the broader 5G world.
Mavenir is one of these challenges. I mean, Mavenir is quite active in other areas than the radio access network, which is what we're going to talk about. And I think gets most of its money actually in other areas that aren't the radio access network, sort of core and IMS software that they've been doing for a long time. That's the main part of its business.
Right.
But they've been trying to push, they're one of the RAN challenges that came along with this Open RAN movement that emerged in the sort of 2017.
I did a big thing with them at Mobile Congress this year about Open RAN.
Yeah. They're a real cheerleader for Open RAN, and they wouldn't even they'd be quite happy probably with that description. I think in the way that Daniel Royston's quite happy to be called a cheerleader for public cloud.
Yeah.
They're
they get pom-poms.
Yeah, they're a US company. They're private equity backed. They've sort of formed from the merger of several other companies. I mean, the history of it's quite complicated, but today they have this sort of bigger business doing core and IMS software and some other things, and then they have this unit that's trying to sort of crack into the RAN. And had some successes, I think. If you go back a few years ago, they got this deal with Dish Network, which we talked about a little bit earlier on. The fourth US operator.
As far as smaller kit vendors go, they seem quite prominent. Mm-hmm. They're always quite a big presence at trade shows and all. I mean,
that's the thing. I would say they're probably, to me, they're the most prominent Open RAN company.
Okay.
There's a proper Open RAN company in the sense, if you take the incumbents out of the picture, like Nokia and Ericsson saying we do Open RAN now as well. Forget about that. Not that that's insignificant, but obviously the purpose of Open RAN, one of the purposes was to bring diversity into the market. So if you just have Ericsson and Nokia saying we're Open RAN now and nobody else is around, it doesn't really change
Whereas
anything.
If Open RAN had really delivered on its promise, then that would be to the benefit of people like Mavenir and Parallel Wireless and so on.
And I mean, a few years ago, you had these three US companies, software developers, very much coming from the sort of baseband software side of things, which were Mavenir, Parallel Wireless, and Altiostar was the other one. They were the kind of three, the three wise men of Open RAN.
Right.
And it's not really worked out that brilliantly this is quite interesting geopolitically, I think, because a lot of this was going on.
Segment.
Yeah, it will, but a lot of this was going on back when I think Trump was in power first time around, and you got this feeling there was a kind of push to try and have US,
Yeah.
US
Because
companies
Trump,
in the
God,
mix.
if you associate nothing else with Trump politically, as opposed to his personality and his weird orange fucking foundation that he insists on wearing the whole time, it's that he's an economic nationalist. It's all about re-onshoring jobs.
Yeah.
I think a lot of his rhetoric is bollocks, like he's trying to pretend that they're, I don't know, dying industries like coal mining or something will resurrect or something like that.
Yeah.
But he is quite
I don't
consistent
think he is
on that
this
one.
time around, is he?
No, I'm
But
probably...
he was the first time.
I'm probably misattributing that, but I'm using that partly as sort of hyperbole, just to, there's certain things where the genie can't be put back in the bottle.
This time around, some of his stuff's a bit odd. I mean, like, tariffs that high on Chinese goods that aren't made in the US, and also you're trying to sort of limit like low cost labour that's illegal. Yes, but it's how you get things done.
It's quite incoherent.
Weird, everything is going to become so expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
it really struck me when he went on Rogan, and almost inferred, and Rogan actually went to him. Did I just hear you right? Well, he almost inferred that you could get rid of income tax and replace it with tariffs.
Right.
Which seems...
And he quoted at the time when it worked, which was 140 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. Mercantilism. It's not even capitalism. It's like the old British Navy going up and down. And
everyone knows that in those intervening 140 years, the reason everyone is better off is because we're not protectionists, we're not mercantilists, and we do open up trade, and the rising tide lifts all ships and all that shit.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's Trump's weirdness. But yes, the reason it's relevant is because
it's totally relevant because he's very much seen as a protectionist and someone who wants to kind of have there was this feeling that we need to have our own 5G developer. I think actually one of the problems this gets to the whole 5G negativity side of it, is that 5G was perceived to become a much bigger thing than I think it's turned out to be. There was this feeling
as an ROI proposition.
As an ROI proposition, and also I think geopolitically, I think it was perceived to be a much bigger thing. They were talking about people like Marco Rubio, by the way, who's now Secretary of State.
Going to be, yeah.
And has talked about 5G quite a lot. He was going on about 5G. He
once retweeted light reading, didn't he?
He did. He's a reader of light reading occasionally, probably like
when it suits his political purposes.
But he's he was going on at one time about 5G being everywhere. It's in insulin drips, it's in planes. I mean,
the ubiquity,
because that was this whole concept of the Internet of Things and having 5G in. For sure, that's why they're so bothered about it. That was the whole reason why there was a concern about 5G in the way that there was never the same concern about 4G, because 4G was always perceived to just be a voice and data.
Yeah, a mobile broadband thing.
Broadband, whereas 5G was this thing that would go everywhere.
Ubiquitous,
and be in machines and be in equipment that's like
and it may do
sensitive and critical. And if you had a Chinese vendor there doing it, then you could potentially just
they could hack into the whole country and turn us into zombies.
And then who are the other two? You've got these two weird little Nordic companies that haven't done a very good job in 4G. They've lost loads of market share, and it looks like they're way behind. That was a perception. Maybe we can, we don't want patents being controlled by China or maybe Europeans. Let's try and get into this in a bigger way. And Open RAN was a part of that story, I think, because trying to create a company from the ground up would be hard. I mean, they're seeing that with the chips thing now, right? Just to sort of create a fab on the. It's the same thing. It's the same thing with trying to create a Nokia from scratch.
Indeed,
they just aren't there. You can't. It's just too hard to do that. So the nice thing about Open RAN, and I get the rationale, is that you have interfaces between the different bits of it, so you can allow someone who's a specialist in one of those areas to focus on what they do and put all their R&D into it, and not have to worry about, we don't have the other bits, so we can't sell it to a telco. We have to kind of work with a bigger vendor to sort of do the stuff we're not doing. With Open RAN, the idea is that you'd have these interfaces that would link your stuff to somebody else doing another bit that they specialize in, and they'd link that to another bit that a company specializes in, and it all sounds really good, and I get the rationale, but it's just not really worked out. It's just not gone that way at all.
Exactly. So like pivoting it back to Mavenir, so we've kind of set the scene of something that Mavenir bet heavily on hasn't turned out to be what most people hoped it would be.
Yeah, exactly. So
but what is your, why right now are you writing this thing about Mavenir risking default or restructuring?
Well, the risk of the default and the restructuring is specifically linked to an S&P note that's just gone out, saying they risk default or restructuring. So that's not.
So that's their filing. Oh no, that's Standard & Poor's.
Standard & Poor's says that they've got
like an analyst note
debt
type
obligations due in January that they can't meet, and the only way they're ever going to be able to meet those debt obligations is
I see. So that's very imminent.
Yeah, so they need to get an extension on maturities, or they need to get an injection of funding from their financial investors, who are mainly at the moment Sirius Capital and Koch Industries, but Coke, I think it's supposed to be pronounced, but it's spelled Kocha.
It's funnier the way you said it. It sounded a bit like a rude word.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be pronounced Coke. But yeah,
Coke
Industries.
So I don't
Sirius
keep smirking
Capital
at you.
Have put a lot of money into Mavenir over the last few years, by the way, 830 million since 2020.
And people like Sirius Capital and Coke are not known for chucking around hundreds of millions of dollars without a fucking return, are they?
Well, I think they've probably put. I mean, Coke put 500 million in. If you remember, Mavenir tried to have an IPO back in sort of 2020, 2021, right. And then it got aborted because Coke came along and put 500 million in, and the plan was to use that to do radio units to sort of.
So they were basically betting on Open RAN opening.
They were betting on a position in the RAN market is a lot bigger than the market for core network software. And therefore, Coke had obviously come along and bought into the idea that Mavenir can be a disruptive force and carve out a position. They probably also bought into the idea that 5G would be a growing thing and that the RAN market was going to get bigger. Unfortunately, none of this has worked out. The RAN market fell. But
also the timing, sorry to interrupt, the timing's a bit weird because a lot of the 5G RAN spending had already happened by 2020.
Well, I think 2020 is still pretty early for rollout. I mean, the first few years of it, and even now, there's an argument that not enough's been rolled out. You know, we're still in a poor coverage situation. But the problem is that the telcos themselves. We talk about this all the time. The telcos themselves aren't making any extra dosh from 5G. Yeah, they're quite negative about it. It's not really done anything for them business wise. There's a lot of cost cutting going on. You know, salaries have gone up, so their main emphasis is to. You know, there's a big inflation spiral. The main effort for them is to actually cut costs. They want to try and sweat assets that they've got. They don't want to be investing in 5G unnecessarily. They don't see the benefit of it at the moment. Those new use cases have not really come about. So things just haven't worked out very well. And as a result of that, the market's down. I mean, Omdia said RAN product sales were down, I think it's 11% last year to about 40 billion. Globally, their forecast now is bad for this year, by the way. I think they were expecting this year to be a bit better originally. Now it's a forecast of 10 to 15%.
Yes.
Where's it going to go next year? I mean, it's probably not. It's not going to shoot up again. It might be flattish. It might be a bit of an improvement. It might be a slight dip, but it's not going to be brilliant next year. And meanwhile, these companies that came along talking about Open RAN, if you look at Omdia's market share data, Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei combined have actually grown their market share over this period that Open RAN's been there, I think. Certainly in the last year or so, they've actually edged up a little bit in terms of market share. The only real competitors that are sizable at all are ZTE, which is another Chinese vendor that we're not allowed to use. And that's even more of a dodgy one for a lot of European governments.
Well, and ZTE, after it got all government. And after it got all that aggro off the Yanks in about 2018, they kind of retreated a fair bit anyway.
They did.
Because that was an existential thing for them.
Yeah, well, they're not on the entity list. They can get US components.
No, but I think they've just thought, fuck this. It's too dodgy.
Yeah. I mean, they're mainly in like Africa and China.
I mean, I was still out hanging out with them in Istanbul, so it's not like they're not.
I bet there was a lot of African operators there.
But I just noticed scrolling down this light reading one, when I get a bit further down, there's me talking to Summer Chen from ZTE. As a bit of sponsored content on your site there.
So you've got So the only other ones are ZTE and Samsung, which is Samsung, by the way, is not a good company for people like Mavenir and Altiostar and Parallel Wireless, and those are all different companies now, by the way, than they were in Trump 1.0 to be comparing themselves to, because Samsung's got an annual R&D budget across the group of more than 20 billion. It's got it claims to have a lot of synergies it can realise. You know, it can take a hit. It's a world leader on chips. It can take a hit while things aren't going that well without having to go, where's the money coming from? And Mavenir and Parallel Wireless and Altiostar can't do that. So what happened to Altiostar, by the way, which is one of the ones we mentioned a few times, is they got bought by Rakuten, which is the Japanese e-commerce company.
And Rakuten's had a slightly
Rakuten's not been doing brilliantly. The bit that Altiostar's part of now, and it's now been rebranded as Simran, because they have this unit called Rakuten Symphony. So anything Sim something.
Yeah.
Is trying to
We had
sell.
Jeff from there on.
We did,
on the pod.
and they're trying to sell their software and their products to other telcos. Again, very, very little sign of success. The only notable deal is with this company called 1&1 in Germany, and it's not really gone according to plan because they're.
It does feel like a lot of our scepticism over the years, and God knows we've covered this enough on the pod.
Well,
but a lot of our scepticism over the years seems quite vindicated, and I'm not happy about it.
No, I'm not either. But we have been vindicated, I think.
So let me just because we've got like less than half an hour left, and we've got another segment. I just want to like tie a knot in the specific Mavenir. So we've done a lot of framing.
Yeah.
And I think is this. I was just scrolling through. I was just going to ask if you got a response from Mavenir. I've seen one thing.
There are several comments in there.
Right.
When the story first went up, Mavenir's press department, by the way, when I contacted them initially, said we'll get back to you in a few days' time.
Well, that's not good.
So I thought, well, I'm going to publish the story then. And then this morning they submitted a load of comments and went, oh, we told you that we needed a bit of time for it.
Tough shit, that's not how it works.
So I did incorporate the comments into the story, the ones that I thought were relevant. Some of it was boilerplate blather, I thought. Some of the stuff that was...
So there's one that said, we're in good standing with our lenders and do not comment on reports from others. Well, that's not much, is it?
That doesn't answer the question because, by the way, that was in response to a report saying they missed interest payments last month.
Right. So September, actually.
So the question is, did you miss interest payments? You know, and are you seeking...
Indeed.
It's not we're in good... saying we're in favourable terms with our lenders isn't really answering the question because you could say that, you know, you could... I don't know. It just doesn't really get to the point properly.
So the essence of it for me is... and there are some other companies in the space that I'm aware of. I had one lead where I didn't write it up because I didn't think the peril was imminent enough.
Yeah.
And one tries to be responsible about these things. And believe me, I don't mean that as a barbed comment about you.
Well, this is pretty imminent.
Well, exactly. That's what I was going to say. So, I mean, the most absolute thing they could address is if they've got some debt maturity coming up in January and they don't currently have the funds to meet it, how are they going to resolve that situation?
Yeah.
I mean, if I've understood your story correctly, that's the long and short of it.
Well, the way they would meet that situation, according to Standard & Poor's, is they get some kind of extension on those maturities,
which does happen quite often.
Does happen, or they get somebody else coming along and investing in them. But how long is this going to go on with people chucking money at Mavenir? As I say, 800. I think it's 830 million. I calculated they've raised now since 2021. Close to $1 billion.
And they're still struggling to pay their bills.
And they're still struggling to show that they've made any traction at all in Open RAN. The only big deal they've got really is with Dish, which is cutting spend at the moment. They made a big deal about going into India and doing stuff there. All the major jobs have gone to the usual suspects: Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung. There's very little evidence of them anywhere. If I'm going to be... because my article's actually pretty balanced, I think, if you read the whole thing.
Yeah, there's plenty of it.
So the things that I think are in their favour at the moment that could potentially do something for them are Vodafone. Vodafone's got this site tender going on that it's been talking about now, it seems, for years, but it's actually only been about a year. But they keep going on about this 170,000, sites across Europe and Africa we're putting up for tender. It's not 170,000 sites. When I went to Fuse, I got that from Paco, who's the head of Open RAN there. They've obviously sold Italy. They've sold Spain. Vodafone's shrunk compared to where it was even a year ago, 2 years ago. So it's not going to be 170,000 sites, but it's still a significant. We're still talking about tens of thousands of sites, and 30% of that they want to be Open RAN. And Mavenir is definitely in the mix. Mavenir is a company that's in that tender.
Yeah,
and Vodafone said very positive things about Mavenir in the past. When Iago Tenorio used to be there, he recently left to join Verizon.
Yep.
This is quoted in the story, by the way. He was gushing about this radio unit they developed. We're going back to the radio stuff.
Yep.
Apparently this one, no
Did
fans.
It have a fan?
No fans. Yeah. I didn't get that from him, by the way. I got that from someone else.
Okay.
Who you probably guess who it is.
Right, but, yes, I can guess.
But no fans on this radio unit. He said it's the best thing they've seen compared with all the incumbent stuff. He said it was this thing they developed with Qualcomm, really, really cutting edge.
So maybe that will be the thing, and I am really going to wrap it up because we're running out of time. Maybe that will be a thing that might encourage people to roll over their debt or reinvest in them.
Here's the problem for them. The one thing, just to finish off on this then, and this is S&P alluded to this as well, and I got this from a company talking on background about them at Fuse, is R&D costs when you go into radio hardware, which they've done, by the way. They started off in software. This is why Open RAN, they've basically expanded into other areas. They're not a specialist anymore. So they've completely betrayed, in a way, the concept in itself by diversifying now into systems integration.
Potential over-diversifying.
They're making themselves look more like an Ericsson and Nokia. And once you start competing against Ericsson and Nokia on a like-for-like basis, you've got to match what they're spending on R&D. Let alone Huawei. Ericsson and Nokia spend, the estimate is about $5 billion a year together on research and development into the RAN. This is a company whose revenues a couple of years ago, and I don't think they've gone up since then, combined all the stuff, by the way, not just RAN, but core, were about 500 million.
Right.
We're spending about 80 million on R&D.
Yeah.
It's,
and then Huawei spends more than Nokia and Ericsson combined on R&D.
This 500 million, Pardeep Kohli, when I interviewed him last year, said that was pretty much going into radio unit designs. Yeah. But those radios, if they don't sell them, they've got to do the same thing next year. Everything moves on.
Yeah.
Every year you've got to spend that much money again and again. By the way, Earl Lum is quoted in that story.
I did notice towards the end. Yeah, good old Earl. Good old My Name is Earl.
He's been a bit of a theme of this podcast. This particular
well, let's move away from Earl. You've had enough time, Earl. I'll say it. I asked Ian, because I've never spoken to Earl Lum, but I asked Ian to say to Earl that he's more than welcome to come on the pod. I think it's US based. But
don't read that out, what I'm just showing you, but...
Okay, right.
I'll
we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah. But yeah, Earl, if you're listening as well, I mean, you look like you'd be a fascinating guy to have on to dig into this and other stuff that I'm sure you know a lot about. Anyway, let's move it on quickly in the sort of 20 minutes we got left. Onto the tiny little topic that we'll easily cover in 20 minutes of geopolitics.
That's a quick one.
Do you know what I mean? This is a problem. This is one of the reasons I always leave my self-indulgent ones towards the end. At least it's sort of self-limiting, and I can't go too far down the rabbit hole. I mean, what I want to start off with is the thing I sort of teased at the start, which is this chap Brendan Carr. So the way they do in the States, nearly everyone in public office, at least at a senior level, is a political appointment, which means they're appointed by either a Democrat or a Republican, which means that everything involves a sort of tribal partisan dynamic. And in the FCC, you have 5 commissioners, and 3 of them are appointed by, including the chair, by the party that's in government, and 2 of them by the party that's in opposition. And so you tend to have things coming through where the 3 all vote in unison and the 2 always vote against them. And so you get a bit like the Supreme Court, you'll get dissents where they go, okay, we're going to do this. And then you'll get the 2 other ones go, yeah, this is why we think that's bollocks.
Yeah.
And so this guy Carr, I think he was originally appointed to just be a commissioner by Trump in his first term, which let's not forget was, had a 4-year gap between his first and second terms. And he's been there for a while. And one of his big things, which really interests me, it's not core telecoms, but it is communications, is freedom of speech. Now, they've got... there's a thing that I've written about a lot. You remember I spent ages summarising the Twitter files and things like that. I have always found the issue of, I suppose... election interference on social media interesting. The most egregious example of it was in the lead up, around this time 4 years ago, October 4 years ago, there was a big scoop where the son of who ended up being the president, called Hunter Biden, who had substance abuse problems and a fairly sort of hectic private life, had left a laptop at a repair place. And according to whatever the T's and C's of this repair place is, after he didn't pick it up for a while, the bloke just sort of got it and hacked into it and found lots of juicy shit, right. Which, apart from the more salacious stuff to do with Hunter Biden's private life, also seemed to at least infer that there might have been a bit of corruption that even involved, there was reference to the big man.
Right.
Anyway, the interesting thing about it, so this is all ancient history, but the interesting thing about it is it came out and all of social media conspired or coordinated to make sure that story wasn't disseminated. You couldn't even share it via direct message on Twitter or Facebook, if I remember rightly. And so, and it's possible that if that story had been more widely made available, and the inference that Biden was involved in some corruption had been more widely known, that it might have had a material effect on the outcome of that election. So it's quite serious.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, they're only delaying Trump's comeback by 4 years. And so I find that sort of stuff really interesting. And so does this chap, Brendan Carr, who Trump has just nominated to be the chairman of the FCC. So the biggest angle on Carr is that the assumption is that the FCC is going to be very interested in freedom of speech moving forward, especially as it affects social media. And now I'm just going to pause for breath quickly.
And a swig of your
That's
lovely
not a breath.
American pale ale. That was more like...
I breathe pale ale. And then that gets onto a thing called Section 230, which is a piece of American law, which, to paraphrase it, basically says that that social media platforms or internet platforms in general, it could even be back when we used to allow comments on our sites, which we don't right now, mutter. Hopefully that'll come back one day. That we're protected from legal liability from whatever a third party puts on our comments or even more importantly on social media, which includes things like YouTube. You know, it's impossible for even Google to moderate at the scale that YouTube exists, because there are like millions of hours of video uploaded to YouTube all the time. They can't watch through each one and make sure someone's not saying something defamatory or whatever, or downright illegal like incitement to violence. So they're protected by this thing called Section 230. And what Carr and I've heard, and I think I've reported on Trump saying this before, he wants to make Section 230 stuff conditional, which I think is really interesting. I've long advocated for this on Telecoms.com, that obviously they should have the protections, but they shouldn't be unconditional. And what I would like in an ideal world is for them to be compelled to only censor as far as national law dictates.
Yeah.
So they have to censor things that are obviously criminal, like incitements to violence and the propagation of, you know, some of the stuff we spoke about with Harry last week from Ofcom, like, you know, the stuff to protect kids and all that sort of thing. If the law says that, then you got to censor that, that's fine. But if they censor according to their own discretion and their own particular system of weights and measures, then I think it's fair enough to withdraw that protection, because then they're acting like a publisher, not a platform. They're putting their thumb on the scales of the content that goes there. Yeah. So that's one of my big things about that. I might make this a bit of a sort of ranty monologue because we've got so little time, but interrupt any time if you want to. And just moving on to one or two other geopolitical things, which I want to flag up. Quickly cracking open one more. I did go on to a third, I've got to admit, but that's it. I'm definitely not having more than three.
There's only one left. You might as well do it.
Fuck off, mate. I've got stuff to do later. My big thing is once I've finished presenting all the awards, then I'm like, for God's sake, give me a glass of wine. Yeah. I wrote this last week. The headline was, as collateral damage mounts, US continues to escalate Cold War with China. So I was basically fusing together two bits of news. One was quarterlies coming from the company that I mentioned earlier, Applied Materials, where basically they've gone from a really large proportion of all their sales going into China to it suddenly dropping off, and them having a share price hit because they had to, you know how normally when people do quarterlies, the thing that affects the share price more than anything else, and left to completely missed numbers, is their outlook. Yeah. Because share prices are actually a bet on the future. They're not a bet on the present. Yeah. And they went, look, sales are going to go down from China, and then I've got a quote from them. Where is it? Yes. So I'll just read my own paragraph. The company was keen to downplay the notion of exceptional circumstances in China. Quote, "We think that's a normalized rate." Applied Materials' Bryce Hill said on a call with analysts, according to the Wall Street Journal. I was journalising WSJ on this. And then quote again, "It was elevated for a few quarters, even up to the mid-40s, which I think is like the revenue level. And that was because we were shipping DRAM demand to some specific China customers when it was allowed. And I just dwelt on those last 4 words, when it was allowed.
Yeah.
Because the inference from that is the levels may have remained that elevated had not this thumb on the scale from the US's desire to starve China of advanced semiconductors being put in there. So that's all I want to say there, is that's just another little anecdotal data point on how America's desire to put the Chinese technological genie back in the bottle, which I think is ultimately futile. I understand why they do it. I was listening to a brilliant podcast with a guy called John Mearsheimer, who calls himself a realist.
Yeah.
And basically, as a realist, it means that he calls it as they are, not right as he wants them to be or as they should be or anything like that. It's just as they are. And he says, as a realist, yes, of course, America is going to try and suppress China. Because as China gets more economically powerful, it's going to get more militarily powerful. And America's used to, the people describe it as a unipolar world. Certainly since the Second World War, and for the whole rest of the 20th century, it was a unipolar world. There was only one proper superpower, and that was America. Yeah, there was the Cold War, and Russia had nukes and all that sort of thing. But in terms of economics and culture and global influence, there was only one real player in town.
Yeah.
And now that's under threat. The global hegemony, which is another of these little terms that people throw around, that America's enjoyed, is under threat principally by China. And they're trying to do something about it. But I think it's misguided. I think it's morally questionable. Who's to say China can't be as powerful as America? And I just don't think it's going to work. But my point about applied materials is there's collateral damage. So in a bid to remain several levels above China in terms of technological development, they're willing to make their own companies suffer, which I think is a bit paradoxical.
Yeah.
And then there was one other little bit which I linked to in that story, where I said, meanwhile, the US intelligence community took the opportunity this week to accuse China of hacking American telecoms networks. I don't know if you saw that. It was a very vague announcement that was a joint statement from the FBI and CISA. What does CISA stand for? It's CISA. It's America's Cyber Defense Agency. It's still not that. Security and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Yeah.
No, cybersecurity. Blah, blah. Yeah. And so they came up with a joint statement that said, look, the Chinese are up to no good. But it was completely top line, completely vague. They didn't say who they hacked into. I think I saw reporting subsequently, funnily enough, to go full circle, that one of them might have been T-Mobile.
Right.
But my conjecture from that was, because we've got this handover of power going on, I thought maybe it felt like these security agencies trying to raise the stakes, because they're worried that maybe Trump, even though he's often very hawkish and very belligerent towards China, maybe he'll, because he's got this big thing we were talking about earlier. He's got Trump and this chap called Vivek Ramaswamy, who are going to have this division called the Department of Government Efficiency, and they're going to basically try and cut through the overheads, the headcount, the total cost of the state, which me as a libertarian I completely approve of. I'm fucking go for it. And so maybe they're just trying to go, look, they're trying to raise the stakes so that if they try and cut their budgets, they can go, okay, well then you're leaving us open to all this latest dastardly deeds that the Chinese are up to. Yeah,
I mean, I think the geopolitics and the trade war with China, the stuff you're talking about with applied materials, and I do see that kind of. It's hard to imagine it, because I think Biden took it to a new level, actually.
Seemed to,
after Trump, and probably that was a bit underreported, I think, about the aggressiveness,
the escalation.
But I think it's going to go a level further under Trump, because all the indications.
It's so hard to tell with him, isn't it?
Well, all the indications are that it will, and a few of the indications are already clear from the people he's appointed. So you had Mike Pompeo before, I think, in the Secretary of State role. If you remember, he was that guy going around Europe at one time sort of saying, don't use Huawei, otherwise we won't sell you fighter jets. Who have they got in that role now? Someone much more hawkish, actually, Marco Rubio.
Right.
He's a really sort of, I mean, he's specifically called out Huawei. He wrote a piece 3 weeks ago, which I referenced in a story I wrote this week, saying the world goal of Huawei is domination.
Right, so he's not fucking around.
He wants it flushed out of Latin America. That's his current concern. There will be more pressure on Europe especially countries like Germany, where they've come up with this fudge to carry on using Huawei as long as you replace the management sort of system.
Which you've written
There'll be more
extensively.
pressure on them to get rid of it. I've heard speculation from sources that the person who might be the next Commerce Secretary is Keith Crash. Keith Crash was this guy who... yeah, well, it's the actual way it's spelled is Krach. So if he's probably like German origins, and it would be pronounced Krach, but it's
Irish origins, great Krach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But he was the guy who under Trump the first time round had a role in the administration. Who was the guy who came up with this clean network policy, if you remember.
Yes,
which is very much about not having Chinese vendors in the mix, and it's not necessarily having Open RAN people like Mavenir, by the way, just to sort of square the whole thing on that one. But it's more like, as long as we get somebody that's not Chinese there to do your network stuff for you, then we're happier. He was the architect of that policy. He was very sort of bullish on all of that.
Like, I don't know if you agree. The real reason I don't like it, there are lots of more specific reasons I don't like it. Sometimes it feels a bit xenophobic, like there's something intrinsically untrustworthy about the Chinese, and that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. You know, I just spent a week hanging out with 2 different Chinese companies in Istanbul, and you know, we're all just human beings. You know, everyone's just trying to make a living. Everyone's just trying to provide for their families, have a holiday, buy some nice mod cons. All people around the world, doesn't matter where you are, have got the same drivers. We're not fundamentally different. We might look a little bit different ethnically, but that's it. So that's one of my more hippy-dippy, why can't we all just get on type of things. But then you get into the practicalities. It just feels self-defeating. If we could all just fucking take a chill pill, and maybe, you know, this probably applies twicefold to China. I'm sure China's incredibly competitive. And I'm sure a lot of the things that the government is accused of in terms of dirty tricks economically or espionage or whatever are all true. I just wish everyone would just take it down a notch and everyone could just get on with doing business and stop just trying to encumber each other. It's like a war. You know, war obviously impoverishes everyone. Yeah. I mean, everyone knows that war impoverishes everyone involved. Yeah, someone prevails in the end and maybe they benefit from it decades later. But while wars are happening, they impoverish everyone involved. Yeah. So, yeah, I just wish it wouldn't happen, but I fear you're right. I fear it will get even worse, which is a fucking shame.
Yeah.
And then one last thing, and then I better sign off. Just a little exclamation point, nothing to do with all this China stuff. But an interesting thing to note from this week was that some undersea cables got cut in the Baltic again. That seems to happen all the time at the moment. It happened a few years ago, and there was some talk about whether it was a trawler or something. This time, I mean, Europe's just come out and gone, it's fucking Russians. They've been much more direct about it. Maybe it was. And, you know, here's another great illustration of how war impoverishes everyone. So do you remember there was that Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that was sabotaged? And most people reckon that's the Americans now, by the way.
Yeah.
Because they know that that's a great way of severing a massive economic link between Germany and Russia. There's no proof, by the way, and I'm not saying it. I'm just passing on rumours that I've heard. But now we've got these cables being cut and Russia's being accused of that, and I find that completely believable. But it's just destruction. You know, it's just people hitting each other in the face for no apparent reason. And so, yeah, I guess the common theme of all these, and I'll wrap up there unless you've got any last things to say, Ian, is that the telecoms industry is constantly affected by geopolitics, and it feels like more than ever.
Yeah.
And it's just collateral damage, whether it's like technology companies or whether it's cables or whether it's people operating in countries like Ukraine. I'll just say, like tonight, I'm going to have the glow tells. There's going to be people from China, from the Middle East,
from Mavenir.
from your mates at Mavenir. So maybe you'll have an interesting chat with them. But people from everywhere, and that's one of the things I like about it. So there's my signing off. Why can't we just live in peace and harmony and just get on and have a couple of drinks and
Sounds
talk
like we
some
should
shit?
put a John Lennon song on now.
It is, I know. I realise I'm sounding a little bit hippy-dippy, but, you know, that's how I feel. So there we go.
Are you
All
going
right.
to do a little rendition of Imagine to take us out?
Yeah. No, I'm not. I'll do impressions. I won't do songs. I know my limits. So I will sign off there. I think our next one's going to be on a Thursday as well. So I will just say thanks for listening and make sure you join us for that one.